and welcome everyone to this our Tuesday Spotlight on the 1st of April 2025, which does mark the start of our membership year. So just a reminder to those who haven't renewed your membership for the 2025 to 2026 years, please do so now, or thank you very much if you have already renewed. And if you're not yet a member, then please do join us. We're a great bunch. But back to today's event, challenges of climate change for Egypt's Theban Mountain with Dr. Judith Bunbury. We're very excited for the start of a mini-series within our Spotlight lectures here on Tuesday lunchtimes in the UK. This is as a follow-on from our British Academy funded project Climate Change and Heritage Adaptation that we did last year in collaboration with some of the other British international research institutes. We are building a knowledge bank on our website with lots of information about climate change in North and East Africa, and these events are part of that to build on that knowledge. So we're very grateful for the speakers in this mini-series, and of course starting with our speaker today, Dr. Judith Bunbury, who is a geo-archaeologist at Cambridge University. Her work with teams across Egypt has revealed that the environment around ancient sites is often quite different now from when they were founded, and that the landscape, whether the course of the Nile River or the desert and the oases, is one that is constantly in flux. Her current focus is ancient activity in the deserts, finding traces of ancient springs and pools, and noting that current climate change is beginning a change back to conditions previously experienced in the New Kingdom and Roman periods. So, of course, we will be hearing much more about that with a focus on the Theban Mountain today and how some of those issues can be tackled in the future. So all that remains for me to say is thank you very much, Dr. Bunbury, for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to talk about today is a compilation of work at lots and lots of different sites across Egypt, but focused around the Theban Mountain. And I like to start with this image of the bricks being made here in the traditional way and show that our work has built on lots of bricks of different evidence from different sites. So here's the Theban Mountain framed by the Colossi Memnon as it is now. And this was a nice, dry, starry night. But my story starts about 30 years ago when I answered a small ad for a geologist to work with amethysts in the desert from Ian Shaw. And here I am in my suit, having arrived in the Sahara Desert after 3 days travel. And you can see just in the background these bluish rocks, which are the Kefren diorite. So we went to look at these rocks because they're part of a much bigger story. And Egypt is absolutely fantastic lab for studying climate change. So you can see everything from the Mediterranean climate here with the rain that we're experiencing in Italy and the sun that you've got further north, going through the Sahara Desert and then into the equatorial belt where we've got more rain again. And I put some little red marks here. I've worked at sites all the way up and down this section. So that gives us a really good idea of changes through the past. And at the end, I'm going to talk about a site that I'm about to start working there, which has got an interesting comparison with what's going on in Egypt. So great lab. Now back to the Kefren diorites. You can see an abandoned statue block there coming up this loading ramp. And here are some trackways for sledges that were lowered into the or reversed into this. And then this was propped and levered up and onto the sledge. And we kept sinking through this surface sand onto this much harder mud layer. And these blocks were used in these Khafra statues, which were taken to the pyramids at Giza, 800 kilometers further north. So this was a major expedition getting these statues out. And there are those pyramids. So back at the block, we kept landing on this muddy surface and having to dig the vehicle out. That must be our vehicle in the background, or one of them. And on that surface, we found these very tiny snails that does look like a gigantic penny piece. So that these are only a few millimeters long. And I showed them to Richard Priest, who's a malacologist, and he said, oh, these are absolutely famous, these snails, because they were put in the British Museum in a humidity-controlled cabinet. And the humidity control sort of brought them out of their aestivation. That's they go to sleep during the summer, and when it gets damper, they wake up. And they woke up in the British Museum and got up and started eating the label because they were hungry and there wasn't anything else to eat. So they're really a good indicator of drying climate. These ones are actually really dead because they've been waiting for more than 3,000 years for it's more than 4,000 years for it to start raining. So these are very old, and they are from the Old Kingdom surface. Now, also out in the deserts, in the Kargat Basin, we find loads and loads of rock art at places that you wouldn't think people would live now, including these giraffes. They've got a very long neck, and you can see they've got the ears and the little horn things on their head. And interestingly, these giraffes seem to have tethers attaching them to this person and another, potentially a smaller giraffe. The other kinds of things we find out in the desert, these large grindstones. So this one's left as it was abandoned about 6,500 years ago, with the rubber still there. And around it, we've got these root traces, sort of like sort of lime scale around where roots have been struggling with drought. But other kinds of things we find right out there in the Karga Depression are things like this tree stump. There's my notebook for scale. And it was flooded out and buried in the 6th millennium BC. So it's a long time ago. This was all quite wet. So what's happening? What the model for what's happening in terms of climate in Africa? You saw the Google Earth image. We have the Mediterranean rains around the coast, around Alexandria. And then as you go further south into the tropical belt, you've got rainforest and sort of gradually drier. And the Nile is also fed by monsoon rains that come down from the Ethiopian highlands and augment the Blue Nile and cause the Nile flood during the Egyptian summer. So where we're interested in now is the Theban Mountain. And I've been telling you a little bit about the Karga area around here in the Sahara Desert. So we've got summer rains come north, and when global temperatures rise, they come further north. And then the winter rains come south and are driven back by this intertropical convergence zone and can rain on the desert. So a little bit like this, we've got the equatorial rain belt. Warm air rises, creates clouds that create rainstorms, and then that draws in cooler air from the north and the south and pushes drying these desert areas. So this is where the Sahara is. When global temperature gets colder, these ice caps get bigger and the equatorial belt gets smaller. And when global temperature gets warmer, these belts expand and the ice caps get smaller. And here we have global temperature change from the Greenland ice sheet core, freely available data if you want to play with it, available from the University of Colorado. And our grinders come from this peak here, when that tree was growing, and there's evidence for people living around the desert. And we can see there have been other peaks in the early Holocene, but there are also peaks in the early dynastic, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and a massive peak in the New Kingdom, and another fairly big peak in the Roman and Coptic periods. So the times that we find remains in the desert seem to or otherwise coincide with these periods of high global temperature. So let's take this place called Fish Rock. You can see a ladder there. People are getting up to look at the fish graffiti on the rock. And there's our Jeep for scale. And if you reconstruct the water levels, then the lake would be here. You seem to have vegetation around the edges of the lake. And I've pasted in the giraffes that we saw, but some of the other rock art that we've copied, like these lovely wading birds, various types of fish. And I thought this might be a Stegosaurus when I first found it, but people suggested I had it upside down. This is actually a boat, a very primitive boat with a steering oar and some people in it. You also get lots of ostriches in the rock art and also ostrich eggshell on the ground. So this is that was what was happening 6,500 years ago. And now what we have in modern times, NASA has been tracking this. So the darker the green, the earlier it's becoming greener. So you can see greenness stretching northwards towards Egypt and some patches round and about. And you look at increasing rainfall from the same source, we can see it's blue. So the rains are moving north. They're not so much south, further south. They're coming into northern Sudan and southern Egypt, which is what we think may have happened in the past. So this is what the Theban Mountain looks like now. Here are our tents of our expedition with our solar panels and the thunderbox there. And you've got a very dry mountain with lots and lots of little wadis. And to orientate you, there's wadi just over to the right here is the Valley of the Queens. And the Valley of the Kings is behind this peak. This is where we've been working for the last 12 years. And around the area, we find sediments like this. And you can see again those little calcareous things, the rise accretions that show there have been roots in this soil. And this is deposited when we have a lake high stand. So imagine these are a bit like bath rings. So in this bath, there's a sort of stain where the water has come up to. And around the Theban Mountain, we have a whole load of bath rings, which are the stains that have formed when lakes have come up around the mountain in the past. So here's a little bit of a map. So we've got high ones up here, and that red one you've just seen now was later than the lower Paleolithic and earlier than the middle Paleolithic. So we start to be able to date these lakes. And then there was a recent Holocene or more recent Holocene one. So one of my students, Messe Grau, did this wonderful map. This is the Nile Valley in blue coming down here, going round the Theban Mountain there and down towards Aswan. And we can see the Karga Basin here as well. And what she's done is she's coloured it so you can see the lake levels from the middle Paleolithic period. So Fish Rock is in this area here, where we could see that high lake level that I showed you before. And then the Theban Mountain, we've got various lake levels here around these valleys as they impinge on the Nile Valley. So whilst we think of the Sahara being very dry in our modern times, there are times when it's been extremely wet. It's been more of a sort of waterland than a desert. That was from about 80,000 years ago. So the highest bath ring or sediment is here, and that we find that associated with early Paleolithic, so 100 to 400,000 year old artifacts. Then we get the mid Paleolithic one in the red, and then we get the one from about 10,000 years ago in the green, and we find artifacts associated with all of those, as well as going along the valleys. So Emily Hallinan's been doing some work with that, and here she is looking very excited. She's just found her second early Paleolithic hand axe in this red sediment. She found two within about a minute. And these are pretty exceptional finds. She's such an enthusiastic about flint work that she's even had her own scarf fabric made. And this is covered in Nubian cores, which come from the middle Paleolithic. And they produce blades like this. They're very heavy blades. No one really knows what they were used for, but it's a very pervasive culture creating these points. And it may have been for spearing things like ostriches, from which we find lots of ostrich eggshell left over. So that's the middle Pleistocene, 40 to 80,000 years ago. And then when we come to the last 10,000 years, we also have the lower level lake and these later flints. This is Giulio Lucarini and his students working on these finds. So it's wonderful because the archaeological artifacts help us to date those wet periods. So let's accelerate forward now to the New Kingdom. So this is KV11 where I've been working. You'll see my nice desk and classy office decor, including this Keka frieze, which is typical of a king's tomb, as well as all the other inscriptions. It's a bit tricky as a geologist. I was asked to do the geology of this tomb. A lot of it has been painted over, so it's not as easy to do as on the outside of the mountain where there's lots of rock visible. So to orientate you in the Theban Mountain and where we've been working, this is the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. And I showed you Wadi 300 with our tents, which is there. We've also been working Wadi C and D here. That's C and D. And then at this place, Wadi Baria, which is about 7 or 8 kilometers away from the Nile Valley. I'll tell you a little bit more about some of these sites now. So we've explored all over this mountain. This is Wadi A, where there's the Berets tomb and the Hatshepsut cliff tomb. There's Geoffrey Martin and Piers Litherland walking up the Wadi. Geoffrey was 80 at this time, so age is no bar to adventure. This is my PhD student, Graham, who's very brave, abseiling down this crack, assisted by some of the Gunawi workmen who seem very unbothered about answering the phone, straddling this gap. And then this is Graham going down KV20, so going through 200 meters long tunnel into the shale. So we've explored fairly widely. And we came across at Wadi Baria, the most distant site, this family tomb. So this is a typical of a family tomb because you get a central chamber and then you get side chambers, depending on who's died. And those side chambers can have side chambers if their children die. So you get sort of lineages within the tomb. So this is shaft 4. There are three or four groups of tombs. What's quite interesting is these commencements, so shafts that don't turn into anything, the white ones on each end. We'll come back to those in a little while. So what do we find there? We found loads and loads of canopic jars, some of them, most of them quite large. This one was very small, and this was the only boy's canopic jar we found. This was from a small prince who died about 6 months old. And Ahmet here worked on the bones, and we've reconstructed a family, and we found their names from the jars, about 17 queens and princesses of the New Kingdom, probably a Nubian family of Amenhotep III. Here's some of those jars, and you can see they've got inscriptions. Some of these were discovered, the pieces were discovered in 1914 and sold on the antiquities market. It wasn't known where they came from. Now we do know where they came from because we're able to match up the bits of inscriptions back to the jar. What was very interesting was when we came to the surface, the shafts are over here. This surface on the New Kingdom surface had lots of mud cracks on it, as if it was a dried up lake. So this is evidence for really quite wet conditions during the New Kingdom. So that was a big surprise. We explored even further out in the desert. This is Bryony making a very early start to go to a site 20 kilometers out into the desert. And wherever we went, we found evidence of water. So this place we called Relay Station 1 has some caves, and it also has this bit place here that has white marks around it, which is indicative of travertine. So water coming out and producing limestone around the flow and making this white mark. And just in front of all this, that might be evidence for water there, there's all this red stuff in the foreground is broken pottery. Quite a lot of it, about 20 meters cubed, I estimated. If we look at the next slide, I've just colored that in for you, see how much it is. And another surprise, we found this because a trail of broken pottery had come all the way down the Wadi for 8 kilometers from this site, which indicates a lot of rainfall. And the earliest shards are from the New Kingdom, so that shows there's been a lot of rainfall over the last 3,000 years. So I'm also going to show you a little bit now above Wadi 300 from this corner here, a shrine, a place we call the C-7 shrine. There are not very many toponyms in this part of the mountain, which shows not that many people have visited it. So this is what the C-7 shrine looks like. There's some plastering in it and a bit of a wall, as Jenny for scale. And next to it is this panel. Now, it's all a bit scribbly, but you may be able to see emerging from it CXC there and a cross there, which I've sort of clipped out and show you a bit larger there. And also some birds like this one visible there, which I've clipped out there. And then this most recent episode is Islamic scratching to deface these profane panels. It's modern. So Piers got carried away with the iPad, and he's copied all these different episodes of activity. So the earliest things, we seem to have these prehistoric giraffes, maybe, animals with horns there, then and some birds and these strange feathery fronds, which turn up quite a lot. And then we have a person with a cow with long horns, and then a small person apparently worshipping the cow. So maybe this is when Hathor, the goddess Hathor, was thought to be in the mountain. And interestingly, it has this typical New Kingdom eye for this cow. So we think these are a New Kingdom group. And then we have a Christian inscription and the cross from later on. So the puzzle is what kept bringing people back to this place. And again, there's lots of broken pottery. And we think these little mud wasp loops give the clue. See the nests there? Sometimes they're so abundant that the whole surface looks almost like it's been knitted. And these mud wasps drink nectar, capture insects, and then they use wet mud to build these little pots. And they put the insects and their egg into the pot. And then when the egg hatches, it can eat the dead insects, or the paralyzed insects, and then it hatches out and it floats away until it finds another little microhabitat. So what these wasps tell you is that there's a wet microhabitat, particularly the wet mud. They can't travel more than 100 meters from the wet mud. And these wasp nests go over in places over the Roman plaster, so they post-date the Roman activity at the shrine. So we think these are signs that this is a spring and that the inscriptions are records from people coming to the spring at different times when it was active. So this is my geological map with the colours of the mountain. It's sort of layers of limestone. And then I had to remap the whole thing to find out where the wasps' nests were. So we've got intense wasp nests in the yellow centre, and then this is the distribution altogether. And we can see that wherever there are groups of wasp nests, there are groups of sites. So the blue sites are New Kingdom sites, and the green sites are Roman sites, and they all seem to cluster pretty close to groups of wasp nests. So it looks like springs are bringing people far out into the mountain, 7-10 kilometers. The most distant ones we found are 14 kilometers from the Nile Valley. So if we were thinking people were carrying water and pouring it out to make these wet patches, I think that that's a 28-kilometer round trip to pour out water seems unlikely. Seems more likely that this is evidence for springs in the mountain that people come and visit when they can. And when you do get rainfall, like in the winter of 2022 and again in 2020, so this is quite recent phenomenon, you get all this vegetation pop up, these things like Zilla and Zygophyllum, which are drought-tolerant species. And that's the perfect habitat for one of these mud wasps. So I'm now going to talk about Wadi C, where we've recently found the Thutmose II tomb. Knew about the Neferure, said to be Neferure cliff tomb, and here are our tents for scale. And we discovered in this corner the previously unknown burying place of Tutmosis II. Quite a way out of the Nile Valley, and again, it seems really not the obvious place to want to build a tomb, especially not when you think that they describe their graveyards, their cemeteries as beautiful places, and it doesn't really cut it. And I like it very much, but it's not the place that you'd see depicted in the texts with sycamore trees and beautiful places. This was the first time we visited Wadi C, and there's Geoffrey Martin, may he rest in peace, copying an inscription from the rock, the Neferure inscription, with Piers Litherland, the director. And little does she know it, but our inspector is standing almost over the Tutmosis II tomb. So we visited this without having any idea of what an important place it was. But now, with the work we've been doing, this is a large part of the team. We've been exploring just behind there and looking at excavating the Thutmose II tomb. For a long time, we didn't know whose tomb it was until we found these pieces of alabaster, which revealed it was Tutmosis II. There's Rabia, the chief archaeologist, showing the find soon after it's discovered. What was strange was, apart from a couple of jars, we didn't really find anything from of the grave goods, because the whole tomb had been re-emptied. Brian and I ready to go below, and you can just see the entrance to the tomb behind us there. We now think the tomb may be underneath this conglomerate mass, and we've been digging this away. But the first burying place was in this corner here. So that was the ladder up to the cliff tomb. Not a great choice if you don't like heights, but convenient if you do. And this is the entrance to the tomb attributed to Tutankhamun II that was recently announced. And the whole tomb was covered with 1.5 meters of rubble washed down from above and filled with sediment. This is part of the puzzle. So when we got in there, we could see the remains of the star ceiling. There's the corner. And fallen from the ceiling were many pieces of that, as well as a lot of rock, which you can see is broken away in this image. And there's Bryony showing the level to which we think the water came up to in the tomb. So although we think of the desert as a dry place, it seems that not long after Thutmose II was put in here, it was flooded completely to about 1.25 meters. And that they did their absolute best to rescue the king. So this is a rather beautiful image. Amal used D-stretch to treat one of the pieces of the inscription that had fallen off the wall during the flood. You see it's part of the Amduat. So what seemed to have happened was where the water was pressing against the walls, the plaster was soggy but was preserved. But above the area where the water was pressing against the walls, it just peeled off and fell down. And Ode, one of our team, has copied all these bits of inscription and then digitally reconstructed it. And we've got the eighth hour of the Amduat. So again, with a star ceiling and the Kepesh frieze, typical of king's tombs, as Rabia, showing another corner, which preserves the plaster, or Keka frieze, sorry, we have a sense of it being a king's tomb. And just above there, you can see how much of the stone has fallen away. In fact, tons of stone had fallen away. But we were sure it's a king's tomb, but it had been emptied. And this vault here, that's entirely collapsed, appears is indicating the level of the original surface, and we're standing on some of the sediment that had collected in it. And it's a pretty intimidating job. You can see here all that pile of rubble and sediment that had washed in. And then on top of that is all this roof fall that's come down. Hard hats definitely required. I took this photo when they'd all gone off for a tea break. And when we were initially trying to work out whose tomb it was, we could only find this bit of a duck vessel. And frustratingly, you can see it's Tut, but you can't see who. So when on the day that this tiny fragment came out, the workmen were very excited. You can see that we're quite excited. There we have it. So all that excitement was caused by this tiny piece of alabaster here that had enough that we could tell that it was Tutmosis II. So that was a great day. And the next day they had a big feast, sacrificed a goat and had a real festival, because we then knew Tutmosis II to be buried there. But we also knew by this stage that he'd been taken out again very quickly because of the flooding. So they seem to have had to make an extra tunnel and take him and all his grave goods out. So that's the stairway, about 16 steps down into the tomb, give you an idea of the depth of it. Here's the reconstruction of that alabaster jar rim, and that shows you where the tomb is in the corner there, and that's the cliff tomb above. We don't know where he was moved after this, but it's probably under that heap, much of which we've now demolished, but we still don't know whether it's going to be there or not. And of course, people, this made quite a big news story, and this was the Spanish version of this. No one expected this, but they put in this picture of this mummy, which was said to be Tutmosis II, but we're not so sure, because although he turned up in the Dawah Bahri cache and was identified as Tutmosis II, if he was taken out with nearly all of the grave goods that weren't broken, he was probably reburied somewhere else. And if the grave goods hadn't been found, it's not so likely that he was found. So this guy may be a substitute or possibly an imposter. So returning to the climate change thing, if we've had a rainier period during the New Kingdom, we have all these springs and little waterfalls, and which turned into torrents, then it'd be really nice to know what the environment was like in the past. So this is a old kingdom scene with a desert with lots of vegetation and animals, and it seems like the New Kingdom, it was similar to that. And this is where we started doing some work with Carlos Luke in his DNA laboratory in Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. And we took my bouquet from Amana of those desert plants, and we were able to identify them from their DNA. So that was a good first step. What we wanted to be able to do was try and extract DNA from the mud in the tomb and work out what the vegetation around at that time was. Quite a challenge, as it happens. So we thought we'd better first practice on some mud near a home. So this is Must Farm Bronze Age mud that we're digging out, and we put through the lab and managed to get some data. And then the other challenge is to create a DNA lab that you can run on the site of the tomb in Egypt. So we devised this. You can see this is not Egypt, but we were on the fens trialing it on the same Bronze Age fen mud, but with our mobile laboratory that we built here. And what we got from the Fenland mud was this reconstruction. These are the species that came out of the DNA in Bronze Age Finland. So that's quite encouraging. Some fungi, some sort of algae type things, and then plenty of fruiting shrubs. It's quite interesting. So I said to the DNA team, we want to go to Egypt and do this now. And they said, but you need loads of ice to do a DNA lab. You can't possibly do it in Egypt. I said, we can rent an ice cream van. Hanan in our team was very keen on that. She likes ice cream very much. She was hoping we could do DNA and ice cream in the field. Anyway, they took the challenge and they've managed to create a DNA lab in the field. This is Linda in her PPE, protecting the samples from the DNA, not the other way around, and running her DNA lab in a tent. And so if this is the location of Wadi C and the tomb that was destroyed by a flood rushing over this cliff, what would we reconstruct that as in the New Kingdom? Well, I think we might think of it as more like this. So vegetated. And I've put here a tree wherever there was a short tomb shaft like these ones. Maybe we should think of the Wadi Berir tombs as having flanking sycamore trees, as we see in the pictures, the contemporary pictures. And there would have been a little lovely waterfall coming over here. But unfortunately, almost as soon as Tutmosis II had been interred, it got a bit out of hand and it became a torrent and it washed sediment into the tomb and he had to be rescued. There might even have been a little stream coming down here. And now we've seen the landscape in this way, we see lots of evidence for water features, little reservoirs and so on. And many of these sites, like the Valley of the Kings, were revisited during the Roman period, and they seem to have used the same springs, the same sites, often living in the tombs with where the New Kingdom burials had taken place. And we've also working with Rosalie David and a student at ARU to try to work out more about ancient disease and medicine, because it could well be that these wet periods allowed plenty of arid tolerant plants to grow in Egypt, which was how it was able to become so famous for its medicine, because arid tolerant plants tend to be a bit poisonous in order to stop things eating them. And so Rosalie's been doing some proteomics on mummies to find out what diseases they're suffering from, and we hope to work with her more on that. So I just talked about, going to talk a little bit now in the last couple of minutes about what we should be fearful of in future. So we think we see that it was very wet in the New Kingdom in the Roman period. And so if it's going to change back to those conditions now, we should expect it to be getting wetter. And in fact, in United Arab Emirates, this is already happening. So this is Al Jalili Fort. And next week, I shall be going there to explore further, because this was hit by a massive hailstorm last March. And you can see it looks like it's been hit by shrapnel. Not only that, the courtyard filled with water, the mud bricks started to melt. So just as Tutmosis II tomb was damaged in antiquity, this fort is being damaged in modern times, and it's approximately the same latitude, so you'd expect similar kinds of things. Also, wood materials being attacked by termites, so there's also other threats to the heritage. And I'm using this as a parallel because when we're thinking of Egypt, we should be thinking about this Theban Mountain becoming wetter. There'll be more insects already this year because we had 2 wet winters recently. We start to see many more snakes and gerbils out in the desert. So it's a bit hazardous for the men doing the excavation because they're underground in narrow cracks. So we need to think about that. And we also need to think about potential water damage to these monuments that haven't really been proofed against it. So this is the Holy Mountain of Jim. You might be able to see that the C7 shrine is just up here in the mountain. And I'm going to leave you with that image now. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating presentation of the Theban Mountain and the climate change, and a look at the newest discovery that's been on the news lately. So thank you so much. Hi, James. James is one of our trustees. So what are the next projects you'd like to see undertaken to explore Egypt's ancient climate? A great question to round off the event, I think.
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, I do think that the DNA stuff is going to be really interesting. So, but it's a question of working on the getting the materials and working on the process to make sure that we're confident. There are lots of bits to DNA analysis which are quite tricky. So the analytical techniques are a bit unpredictable. So I think it's refining the techniques, and then there are so many things we can work on. We can work on plaster, and we can work on mud fillings in statues, mummy wrappings, anything unbaked, mud brick. So we've got some mud brick from Sudan that we're going to try and explore. DNA is gets very well stuck into mud, into clays, and it's quite difficult to get it back out, but it does mean at least it's kind of safe while it's there. And I think if I was going to answer James' question by sort of stretching it out a bit, it seems like the length of the DNA strands gets shorter with time. So I would love to be able to calibrate the DNA breakdown so we could actually get a date as well as a DNA analysis. And
Wow.
we know our Bronze Age date DNA is quite short because we put it through a DNA sieve, which normally catches whole long strands of DNA, and they all went through. So that shows they're all quite short. So yeah, we're working on it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, interdisciplinary work is definitely the way forward for really
Yeah.
opening our eyes as to the reality of the time. And so I will wrap up by extending a huge thanks to Dr. Judith Bunbury for presenting today, sharing some of the latest work on the Theban Mountain and the tomb of Thutmose II. Thank you so much. I think it's really brought up some great topics around climate change and things to be considering and aware of, like you said at the end. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
And yeah, just a quick note again that our membership year at the EES has started. So it's only because of members' support that we are able to share these brilliant lectures for free. So please do consider renewing your membership or join us if you're not already one of our members. So thank you all, and hopefully see you at some of the upcoming lectures all about climate change in the next few months as well. So thank you, everyone, and thank you again, Judith, for a brilliant lecture. See you all soon. Bye.